Hello, my name is Nicole van Bruggen, and as the co-artistic director of the Australian Romantic and Classical Orchestra, I'd like to welcome you to our second Voyage of Musical Discovery for 2019. We're going to be exploring the cultural and historical contexts of music from the Mannheim Court in the 18th century, and also from Chinese and contemporary Australian music. The first half of this program will be played on period instruments by the Australian Romantic and Classical Orchestra under the direction of my co-artistic director, Rachael Beesley. Following this, Jane Rutter and her Third Culture World Music Ensemble will explore contemporary works with Chinese and Indian instruments. The beautiful city of Mannheim in the west of Germany is less well known these days. But 250 years ago, in the mid-18th century, it was one of the most influential cities in Europe. At that time, cities were established around noble families, and they were known as courts. The Mannheim Court was under the rule of Elector Karl Theodor, who was an avid music lover, and he employed some of Europe's most important and skilled composers and musicians. His Mannheim Orchestra was known as the Army of Generals because of the high standard of their playing. Karl Theodor created a culture in his court where his musical employees could develop and experiment with their music freely. They all influenced and encouraged one another. They worked together to establish a new style, bringing music from the Baroque period towards the classical period. I'm sure we all know that awesome feeling when we're brainstorming as a team and we come up with ideas greater than we would ever imagine by ourselves. That is exactly what was happening in Mannheim. In 1777, Mozart's dad, Leopold Mozart, wrote that Mannheim was a famous court whose rays, like those of the sun, illuminate the whole of Germany, no, even the whole of Europe. This hub of musical activity has become known as the Mannheim School and is best recognized today as the place where they invented a myriad of orchestral techniques, such as the orchestral crescendo, the grand pause, and the quirky devices like the Mannheim rocket and the Mannheim sigh. They introduced the woodwinds into the orchestra, and they refined sonata form. And the concept as well for the four-movement orchestral work known as the symphony. Historically, this was the moment that the Classical Symphony Orchestra was born. Two important movers and shakers from the Mannheim School, who were sadly little known today, were the Czech composer and violinist Johann Stamitz, who's considered to be the founding father of the Mannheim School, and whose own sons became the second generation of the Mannheim composers, and the multi-talented Austro-Moravian Franz Xaver Richter, who was a singer, a violinist, composer, conductor, and music theoretician. He was quite a busy guy. We're going to be focusing on these two influential composers in this program. Their musical style had a profound impact on composers and performers from the classical era and beyond, including the young Mozart, who visited Mannheim with his father when he was 21. We opened this voyage of musical discovery with the first movement of Stamitz's Symphonia in A major, which has the tempo marking allegro assai, which means rather fast, or actually fast enough. Let's have a closer look at that first movement now to discover the different devices Stamitz uses to create that buzz of excitement in the opening half of this first movement. Firstly, the Sinfonia is in A major. Tonalities in music, or the key in which the music is composed, are believed to have different emotional effects on you, the listener. These effects were really well documented in the 18th century, and you can find more information about them online, or even in the library, if you still visit them. But we tend to forget about them today. The key of A major is said to be one of rejoicing and youthful cheerfulness. Stamitz does an excellent job of establishing the brilliant and uplifting key of A major right from the beginning. So there's no doubt about which key we're in now. He immediately introduces a sequence of syncopated melodic figures in the first violin, which gives the music energy and bounce. There's a specific name for this type of syncopated rhythm, which the violins are going to play, and I'm going to be very impressed if you know what this rhythm is called. Have a listen. Any ideas what that syncopated rhythm is called? Oh, I was going to be very impressed. You have an idea? Very good, yes. Officially, that term is actually called a Lombard rhythm, but we commonly call it a Scotch snap indeed. It's notated as a semiquaver followed by a dotted quaver. It was a very, very common rhythmic device in the Baroque period. You might have heard recently that the contemporary singer-songwriter Ariana Grande it's a true story. She was recently accused of plagiarism in a song that she brought out in January this year called 7 Rings. Why, you're surprised I know this? I have a daughter. Funnily enough, the accusers were claiming that she stole their Lombard rhythmic device from them, which gives her song this same energy and bounce that the Stamitz Symphonia has. I think that if they did their homework, they might be surprised that this plagiarism, if it can be called this, goes back way longer than last year's hip-hop releases. Immediately following the Lombard rhythm theme, he introduces a more lyrical theme, something like from an opera. Not surprisingly, this kind of writing is known as the Italian operatic style. From that moment, the rock and roll style for which Mannheim was really well known kicks in. This technique for the first violins is called bariolage. We then return to the opera stage when the second violins join the firsts to sing to one another antiphonally. You might notice that we have our second violins opposite our first violins. This is the historical layout of the early orchestras, and it may be different to what you're used to in a modern symphony orchestra. Notice how the classical antiphony is more effective this way. The opening section of this first movement finishes with a barrage of Italianate arpeggio figures. Fast movements from Mannheim tend to be very high energy, and although Stamitz alternates that beautiful lyrical passage within this opening section, the overall feeling is exuberance and joy. Remember, we're in the key of A major. Throughout this whole movement, the chordal textures and harmonic rhythm are played by the continuo team, or in official terminology, the basso continuo, which is basically a fancy term for the basso, which is the bass line, and the continuo, which means the chordal instruments on top of the bass notes. In today's bands, we'd call them the rhythm section. The function of the basso continuo was really important in Baroque music for providing the harmonic and the rhythmic basis of the music. And this is carried forward into this repertoire in the early classical period in Mannheim and beyond. Can anyone tell me which instruments in the orchestra today are playing the basso continuo parts? The harpsichord. Basso or continuo? Continuo. The harpsichord is playing continuo. Who else is part of the basso continuo team? What was that one you just said? The theorbo, or teorbo, yes. The theorbo. Great, I'm impressed you know that one. The double bass is another instrument in the theorbo in the continuo team. How about the cello? Cello is part of the continuo team. Very good. So we've got quite a large continuo. There's one instrument you've missed though, who's on the stage today playing in our continuo team. Bassoon, there she is. So I'm going to ask our continuo team to play a couple of bars for you so you can get a feeling for each different sound. Some of them you'll know, some of them you might know less well. So Tash, yes, you. Could you please play us a couple of bars? I think we all know the cello, don't we? And Kirsty, could you play us a couple of bars? Beautiful. And now I'm going to ask Jane on the bassoon if you could play a couple of bars. Great. So that's our basso section. Now we move on to the continuo section. Anthony, would you mind playing us a couple of bars? Great. And I was very impressed that someone down the front here knows the instrument theorbo. Are there people in the room this evening who are perhaps hearing a theorbo for the first time? Raise your hands. Quite a few. I thought that might be the case. We don't come across theorbos every day. So I've asked Simon if he'll play more than a couple of bars for us, but first I'll just tell you something a little bit about the theorbo. The theorbo is from the same instrument family as the lute. So both are, of course, the grandparents or the great-grandparents of the modern guitar. Simon's theorbo has 14 strings, 8 fretted strings, and 6 bass strings. So from about 1590 to 1750, the theorbo's primary use was as a continuo instrument, either as part of the continuo team or playing continuo by himself. So I'll just ask Simon to play a bit more than a couple of bars so you can get a sound in your mind of this theorbo, beautiful instrument. Isn't it lovely? When it comes to which instruments will play in the continuo team, there's a certain amount of artistic freedom. Different combinations of all these instruments we have here today would be possible, as long as we have a bass line being played by a cello or a double bass or a bassoon, and as long as we have chordal instruments like the harpsichord or the theorbo, then we have basso continuo. We've chosen for this program this week to combine all these glorious sounds for a really full and varied continuo sound. You might be interested to know that both Anthony on the harpsichord and Simon on his theorbo are improvising most of their notes. They both just read the bass line and then they just fill in the harmonies however they like, within reason, right? To either add more energy or to bring more calm to the music according to what the music is asking for. In this particular Symphonia by Stamitz, though, the inner parts played by the second violins and by the violas are actually also part of the continuo team, just because of the writing that Stamitz has left us. Let's hear the first half of the movement, played by the full continuo team. When we're working with our youth orchestra, the Young Mannheim Symphonists, we're often aware in the first rehearsals that one of the challenges for you as young musicians that you face is when you see your own part, and it can sometimes look a little bit boring. So once you're aware of the influence that these inner parts have on the dynamics and the phrase structure and the rhythm, you'll really notice how important they are. You'd be surprised how much impact they have on the piece as a whole. Let's hear that opening section again, played this time without these integral inner parts. So just with the melody in the first violins and with the bass line, and notice how this feels. You feel something missing? Now we're going to play, they do for sure. Now we're going to play the whole first movement for you with all the parts working together as a team. So listen to the contrasting themes and the devices. Notice how short each of these ideas are and compare them in your mind to classical orchestral works which you might be familiar with, where the composers took this music a step further and elaborated their ideas and themes. Listen to how all these elements combine to create the foundation of a style and a cultural language of the early classical period in Mannheim. All of this in just 4.5 minutes. going to move on now to our second composer from Mannheim, Franz Xaver Richter. In his Symphonia in B-flat major, we can hear some fabulous examples of Baroque compositional devices which were still being used into the early classical period. The first movement of this Sinfonia is inspired by the Concerto Grosso, which literally means big concerto. In a concerto grosso, the musical material is passed between a small group of soloists, which is called the concertino group, and the full orchestra, which is then referred to as the ripieno group. Let's have a listen to that. Can anyone tell me who were the most famous composers from the Baroque period who wrote concerti grossi? Vivaldi wrote some, yes? Corelli, indeed. And did I hear someone say Bach as well? Yes. So composers like Corelli, Vivaldi, and we also missed Handel were probably the most famous. Some of Bach's famous Brandenburg concertos are also concerto grossi forms, but really the Italian violinist and composer Arcangelo Corelli was the king of the concerto grosso, and he inspired many composers to write in this style. The Mannheim composers were no exception. There are so many excellent examples of Baroque and classical composition devices in Richter's music, it was really hard for us to choose which to focus on. Can anyone tell me the name of the composition technique when a motive or a theme is repeated a few times and each time moves up or down by step? A sequence, indeed. There are lots and lots of sequences in Richter, in this movement particularly. The violas and cellos follow on from that opening concertino section we've just heard with a first great example. Over the top of that descending sequence, we have one of my favourite composition devices. Have a listen and tell me what this is called. What are they called? I can hear suspensions. Yes, suspensions. Suspensions are my favourite. The suspension is when tension is created in the music by holding over a note which clashes or causes a dissonance with another note. I always love playing suspensions. Rachael, in fact, can we please hear those suspensions again just for me, but more slowly? Wonderful. Suspensions are historically significant to the Baroque and classical period in particular, because this music is all about tension and release in the harmony. Let's put the suspensions now on top of the descending sequence and hear how these two devices work simultaneously back in tempo. A few bars later, there's a modulation into the dominant minor key of F minor. I mentioned earlier that we're performing on period instruments. This means that the string players are playing using gut strings on their instruments. Playing this minor theme on the gut strings gives the musicians the possibility to create a variety of textures and colours. Have a listen to the sound that they can create with their strings in this theme. Very mysterious. Beneath this kind of high, spooky violin line, the continuo team has taken over the suspension idea. Then there follows another concerto grosso section with the concertino and the ripieno sections alternating, and then we have a great example of a rising sequence again. Can we hear this sequence passage actually, building from the bass, one section at a time? Everyone has their own ascending sequence. Let's hear all of those different ascending sequences at the same time now. I mentioned earlier about the quirky Mannheim devices, which were used by the composers. One of the devices is called the grand pause, or the general pause, which was first introduced at the Mannheim Court, but was used famously to great effect, of course, later by Haydn and Mozart. I'm going to ask my colleagues now to play through the whole first movement of this Richter Sinfonia. Listen for the alternating solos in the tuttis and in the concerto grossi sections. Feel how effectively the tension builds through the movement with the use of suspensions and these ascending sequences, and especially notice the grand pause just before the recapitulation. Another one of the trademarks of the Mannheim School language was the beauty of the cantabile arioso, written for instruments. This is where the composers take a form or an idea from vocal music, like an aria or a song, and create instrumental versions. The Andante movement, second movement of this Symphonia, is a beautiful example of this. The sublime melody of the movement is played by muted violins. Listen again to the unique colours of the gut strings in this melody. Often we don't know the words or the source of the inspiration for the melody, but that doesn't mean we can't make up our own words to match. As performers, we do this often, and it helps us to imagine the story and the characters in the music. Why don't we sing these 4-bar antecedent, consequent, or call and response phrases together with the continuo team? The continuo string players, by the way, are using pizzicato here, together with the theorbo. I'll ask the musicians to sing their parts first for us while they play. Listen carefully, because you're going to join in next time. And now with you. The second phrase, have a listen. And now tutti. Here's the third phrase. You've got to listen better. Here's the third phrase. That was beautiful, thank you. Do you have a cultural tradition of singing in your family? Cultural identity is often passed on through song, and oral traditions in music are ways in which cultural and historical elements are passed from generation to generation. So while we listen now to this whole beautiful aria, pay attention to the role of the continuo, the singing violins and the lilting triplets, and reflect on the ways that you engage with your own cultural identity. this Voyage of Musical Discovery, we've given you a glimpse into the historical and cultural context of the rich musical language from the Mannheim Court and its effects on Western classical music. By looking into the historical environment in which this music was composed, the instruments in which it was played, and the compositional techniques, we gain a better understanding of where our music came from and why. There's going to be a short break now while we reset the stage, and then we're going to continue with Jane Rutter and her Third Culture World Music Ensemble. So please remain in the hall. We'll be as quick as we can, and we're back in a few minutes. I'm very pleased to introduce you to the wonderful flautist, Jane Rutter. Jane's Third Culture World Music Ensemble consists of John Huie, Hugh Fraser, Sally Schinkel, Andrew Wilkie, and Maharshi Raval. The group grew from a chamber funk group, which was an earlier collaboration in the 1980s between Jane and composer and guitarist John Huie. They're going to be presenting a number of new Australian arrangements and original works by Jane and John, and they'll be discussing the historical and cultural context surrounding their music and the ways that they go about blending melodies and sounds of original Australian compositions with new settings of traditional music from China. Please welcome Jane and her Third Culture World Music Ensemble.
Good evening, Sophisticates. We are Third Culture, and that was a piece called La Réunion by John Huie, our guitarist and composer. Because of travel and the exchange of ideas, musically there are cultural and historical influences all around the world, and they're taking place all the time and have been for thousands of years. And our music draws from some of these influences. Music can define man's or your place in the universe. And because of the nature and physics of music, it connects us, humans, on many levels. Let's think about them: emotional, physical, intellectual, and spiritual. And when we experience, as players or listeners, this connection of those 4 different levels, what happens is something magical, what sports people call being in the zone. And that's why it's absolutely fantastic that so many of you are musicians. The work you do, no matter how simple you think it is very important work, because music keeps the emotional portals open. The best composers take an idea and create a world of music within that idea. As in literature, consider this: in each piece of music, there's a protagonist seeking adventure, encountering obstacles, and longing for home. Keep this in mind, because as a composer or a player, only you can tell your story. And your choices in sound colour, texture, instrumentation, phrasing should reflect who you are. And guess what? The music that you write should sound good to you. If you don't like it, change it. John and I attended the Conservatorium High School. It was a golden age because we had Richard Gill as our music teacher for about 4 hours a week. And from the Con High to Sydney Youth Orchestra to Sydney Philharmonia to working as professional musicians, we were all touched by Richard's love of life and his expansive breaking down of barriers. Like Richard, we believe that there are only 2 kinds of music: good and bad. We're dealing with the former, of course. John and I sought to create a new kind of chamber music which drew from influences of jazz, classical, and world music. And we wanted to be a chamber group because in chamber music, everyone gets to be a leader and everyone gets to be a follower. So we like to be inventive, and we love rhythm. And in the context of chamber music, we didn't want to be very amplified, or actually not amplified much at all. So we needed a drummer who plays with his hands. Enter Maharshi Raval, who's our tabla player, who plays with his hands. Because the tabla is tuned, the tabla is a tuned percussion instrument. It provides what's musically known as a pedal, which is the sustaining or repetition of a single note through harmonic changes. It can make a standard progression sound really interesting. It can add ground. It can ground a complex chord progression, making it sound more familiar. It can add emotion or tension to a piece and allow a solo player to explore distant harmonies. Pedal points are as old as music itself. You find them in classical music, in world music, in folk music, through to contemporary music. And much of our music contains pedals. Let's listen to the first idea that John had when he wrote La Réunion, which is a D-strummed pedal. Take it away, John. Let's listen to, brilliant. Let's listen to the flute melody, grounded by the cello. Have a listen to how many notes the cello plays. The pedals are going on all throughout the piece, and John's melodies manage to use every note in the chromatic scale against these pedals. To add a little bit of danger, John has added some parallel fourths with the vibraphone. So let's all just play from the head for a few bars and listen to what Andy is doing against my flute melody. Pedals are usually played in the bass in music, but they can be played as the highest note in a piece of music. Let's listen to the first few bars of the solo flute part in the Mozart D major concerto, where the soloist has a long D pedal. It's an amazing entry for a solo instrument to just have that long note. Now let's have a listen to Mozart's Piano Sonata in A major, number 11. We'll listen to the outer voices first. The cello and the flute will play the left and top of the right hand of the piano. Listen to how it changes the music when Mozart puts an internal pedal. To me, that completely transforms what was already a beautiful melody. It becomes more tender. It feels like home. It almost feels like you've been sick and your mum's made you the best chicken soup that you've ever had in your life, just putting that pedal in the middle of it. You might have noticed that those last two examples by Mozart really only used 3 chords, and the next few pieces we're playing, the next 2 pieces, are actually examples of how the universality of music is based on 3 simple chords, 1, 4, and 5. These chords make up the fundamental rule of Western music theory, and they're used everywhere around the world. And a lot of music that is initially pleasing is based on the use of these three chords. Lift Up Your Veil is from northern China, and it's about a guy he's had an arranged marriage planned for him, and he doesn't know what his bride is going to look like, and he sneaks in to see her, and she lifts up her veil, and he's thrilled to discover that she's a great beauty. Now, in this next piece, John is going to play something that looks a little bit like a rattlesnake. After our group Posh disbanded, John moved to live in China, and he bought a Chinese banjo which is called a sanshan. The music in this piece, even though it's from northwest China, it sounds familiar. It sounds a little bit like bluegrass music from the United States, and some people even call it red grass music. There are a few things I'd like you to listen to in this piece. The 1-4-5 structure, the fact that the melody is based on 7 bars. There are a couple of turnaround segments where the tonality changes. The first is where there's a sort of Pelog scale starting on F, which sounds like this. And there's another point where the 5th is flattened, or the 4th is raised, a semitone, and this also adds some interest and that little bit of danger that we love to the music. This is called Lift Up Your Veil, or Chin Chin. Listen out for the piccolo too that I've swapped to at the end of the piece. The next piece is called Nanny, which means bend in the muddy river. It's also based on these 3 chords, and I'm playing the alto flute in it.
I can only play in 1 key on this thing, so it's going to be...
John just said he can only play in 1 key on the Sunshine. What we want to encourage you guys to do is to look at this 1, 4, 5 chords as the basis for your musical composition, and then to go travelling. This next piece that John wrote has the most beautiful chord progressions in it, and we mainly want to play it for you more than talk, so we're going to cram in a couple of pieces before we all have to go. This piece is called the Largo from the 1421 suite. It's about the Chinese treasure fleet that sailed the world in the 1400s. Listen to the beautiful chord progression, the evocative sound of the alto flute, and the cello imitating seagulls as she plays this series of harmonics. This is a pentatonic piece, a 5-note piece that Puccini used in the opera Turandot, and this is John's jazz arrangement of this piece. Listen to what we're doing with our instruments to start the piece, using a beatbox flute and the rest of the instruments as percussion.
So much, Jane and John and Third Culture, for that fascinating look into your repertoire and the influences from China and further afield. Really fantastic. Thank you very much.